Steven, you're muted.
So thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another Lunch and Learn for Michigan's Children. Today we will be talking about moving Michigan forward on K-12 outcomes, enacting weighted funding formulas. Thanks for being here. Please feel free to identify yourself in the chat where you're from. Just as a point of order, today's program is being recorded, and you will be able to find supporting resources, program notes, and link to this recording on our website. If you have any questions, please feel free to write in the chat box, and we will get to them when we have time at the end. And with that being said, I will kick it off to Matt to introduce our guests, and we will get into the slides.
All right. Thanks, Steven. And thanks, folks, for joining us. My name is Matt Gillard. I'm the president and CEO of Michigan's Children, and you're joining us for another one of our monthly series, our Lunch and Learn series, where we bring you some information and details and try to increase your knowledge around important issues that are facing either our legislature or our government here in Michigan and that are important to kids and families. Today's topic is certainly of that nature. So this is an issue that I've been involved with for a long time, and Michigan's Children as well, going all the way back to our days of involvement with a group called the School Finance Research Collaborative, which authored really the a study, an adequacy and equity study around school funding in Michigan that forms to some extent the basis of the conversation around where we are right now. So undoubtedly, if you follow state government and the state budget, and certainly this year's state budget at all for the last couple of years, you've heard about the discussion around weighted funding formulas and why many people think it's important for our school funding formula, our school funding system in Michigan to shift to a weighted funding formula. So we're going to dig in much more deeply into that today on why that's important and why this is something people need to know about, and certainly advocates for kids and families need to be aware of. And it's certainly getting a lot of attention right as we speak. So we're in the midst of the budget process right now in the state of Michigan, as we typically are. This started with the governor presenting her budget proposal for the next fiscal year to the legislature back in early February, and now the legislature is working through the process and expected to, after they're actually on the verge of embarking on their spring break, and actually the House has already started their spring break. The Senate is about to, but shortly after they return in mid-April, we're expected to see budgets start to come out of the subcommittees and the appropriations committees in both the House and the Senate. All of this aiming towards hopefully a final product presented to the governor by July 1st. That's the plan. That's always the goal. It's actually the requirement under legislation that's in place in Michigan. Last year, that was not what happened. We had a debacle and did not get a budget out until after the actual deadline of October 1st. For a number of reasons, but we're all hopeful that that doesn't happen this year. There's early indications that the parties involved seem more committed to following the typical timeline and moving this forward. But a central piece of that, from the governor's perspective, and really a lot of the testimony that we're seeing around school aid funding and K-12 funding in Michigan right now, is centered around this notion of a weighted funding formula. And so the governor's proposal includes actually codifying the weighted funding formula into the budget this year, and in both the House subcommittee on school aid appropriations or K-12 appropriations and the Senate subcommittee on pre-K-12 appropriations. We've seen testimony, including from some of our guests today, directly on this issue already. And so this is getting a lot of attention, like I said, both from the governor's perspective and from the legislature already. This issue of enacting and getting serious really about enacting a weighted funding formula here in Michigan. And so we're excited to talk about this today. As Stephen said, we'll hear from a couple of experts on this issue and then really open it up to questions that anybody may have around this topic, this issue, or really anything else really around the school aid budget that folks want to ask about. But we know this is a big part of it and an important conversation, so we're excited to get into it. So at this point, I will introduce our guests, Matthew Schuler and Megan DeCracker, and let them take over and give folks some information around the importance and the ideas around enacting a weighted funding formula here in
All right.
Michigan.
Thanks, Matt. I'm also Matt. I'm Matt Schuler. I'm the Director of Government Relations for the Michigan Association of Superintendents and Administrators. That's all of the public school superintendents in the state. We have over 600 members. We just have a few slides, and Meg and I think, are going to kind of work together on this. Uh, let's go to the first slide, Stephen, on just the SFRC, since Matt already brought it up. Yes. Oh, there we go. So Matt already talked a little bit about it, and I know he was involved. So this was a collaboration between business and education that I believe it was kind of charged with them in 2016, and it was completed in 2018. It was research based, created by experts. And this is very important, especially as Megan kind of talks about similar models in other states. This was made and designed for Michigan specifically. It took into account Michigan's population and Michigan's needs. And basically, it said, kind of the title of this slide, what does it cost to educate a student in Michigan? And one of the pieces of that is the topic today, which is a weighted funding model. And it just at a very, very high level, it's basically saying that services cost different amounts for different student populations, and it's calling for a kind of a stable, predictable formula to recognize that. So the two areas that the governor focused on in her exec rec are ELL funding, so English language learners, and at risk, so economically disadvantaged students. And for those two areas of funding in the school aid fund, she proposed more than a double increase from the foundation. So the foundation increase is the general, the foundation allowance is the general increase that every school gets, and that in the governor's recommendation that was 2.5%. But for ELL and at-risk funding, the governor proposed 6%. So it's kind of doubling up on that investment for that population. And then more importantly, she really, her and her team went towards an actual weight. And what we mean by that is those two areas aren't really their own separate categorical line item anymore, at least in some respects. They're kind of folded into the base foundation allowance, but then they're given a weight for those students. And there's a lot of math, but basically for that population, for each district, they get a higher weight. And so that's just the very high level, and we'll get into more specifics. But I want to turn over to Megan to kind of just go through, this is not a unique idea, and a lot of states around the country and a lot of high performing states have already moved to some sort of this model.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, I'm Megan DeCracker. I work with National Heritage Academies. We are a charter school management company. Michigan's our home state, so it's where we have the most schools. But we also work in states across the country, like Colorado and Louisiana, that have already moved to a weighted student funding formula model. And Colorado did that a few years ago. They are taking a slow approach, probably 8 years, and they're saying, what are we going to do each year, year over year, to put more money for the students that need it the most and provide a stable, predictable, and adequate funding source. So schools don't have to wonder, am I going to get a categorical that allows me to meet these students' needs this year, or maybe I won't get it next year? I think one of the things that I always talk about is the last time the school funding formula was significantly updated was in 1994. And I don't know if you want to think about what you were doing in 1994, right? Some of you might not even have been alive in 1994, but there is almost nothing that I do the same way today that I did in 1994. If you're looking for some markers of what happened for the first time in 94, that's when Shawshank Redemption came out. That's when Friends began airing. So Friends just finished this long run they started in 1994. Forrest Gump came out. Life is like a box of chocolates, right? So I think about that with the state budget sometimes. The state budget is kind of like a box of chocolates. I never know which categoricals I'm going to get. And so one of the things that Matt and I, and honestly a big group of others, have been working on are what does it look like to plan so that schools can really make good long-term decisions about how they're going to spend funds. So I think Matt will tell you probably more about that on the next slide.
Okay. We can move to the next slide. So this is from the SFRC, and Matt, I know you're the moderator, but feel free to chime in. Again, I know you were intimately involved in a lot of this. So this is, again, it's a lot of math, but this is from 2018. So that base foundation was at $9,590, and then you can see kind of the recommendations for how to kind of weight above that for certain populations. And you see the poverty weight and you see ELL, and those are the two areas that the governor has decided to focus on. 2 points. One, if you look at this list, there are more than just those two listed as kind of the SFRC's proposed areas that should be weighted. There's special education, there's preschool, and then it's called isolation, but it's not what it sounds like. It's small and isolated school districts that frankly need more resources to kind of get the same level of services. You'll also see at the bottom of the slide does not include transportation and food service. And transportation is an area that I think in the long term, we feel should be part of this process and should be weighted, is again kind of recognizing the different needs and access barriers that certain populations have. Again, the governor proposed just kind of looking at the top two this year, and I think there was a pretty good reason for that. I think that especially special education is, certainly probably the most expensive on this list, but it's also the most complicated. There's a lot of different funding streams for this. There's local millages, there's different methods of delivery. That's one that I think is going to take probably years of just kind of us internally in the field trying to get right before we actually, tell the legislature to try and move this towards a true weight, because this is a lot more complicated than ELL and at risk, which I think are relatively straightforward.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, thanks, Matt, is yes, and there's also the special education blueprint, which was a study around specifically around the funding of special education and financing special education in Michigan that just came out late last year. We're working with a group around, figuring that out and even suggested language for the budget to move us towards that. So, yeah, I think Matt's absolutely right. There's good reason for why the governor focused on ELL and at risk as the two areas to start this. The other thing I'll note is, like Matt said, this was from 2018. You see the preschool as a big component with this. Well, this was well before the governor enacted or embarked upon this universal pre-K and all of this investment, the significant state investment that we've made into pre-K over the last now 7 years, 6 or 7 years. So that's a little bit outdated in terms of how it relates to what we were funding at the time as well. The one other thing that got a lot of discussion with this group back in 2018 that ultimately didn't get included for a number of reasons, and understandably so, was infrastructure or buildings and these things, because we have a huge disparity in obviously local districts' abilities to raise funds and the facilities that they operate in as well. That's a whole another can of worms, if you will, and a whole another entity that certainly we think would warrant discussion from a state government standpoint, but is not included in the conversation around weighted funding formula that we're having here in Michigan.
Yep.
Sorry.
Yep. No. And kind of just to piggyback off of Matt's point, something that I've been asked by a few legislators who are pretty knowledgeable on this and have worked on this as well. How is this different from what we've already been doing? And to some extent, that is true, as Matt kind of said. Since then, Megan said 1994, but even since 2018, we've seen a pretty big shift in some of these areas. Preschool has seen a huge investment. ELL and at risk, especially the last 2 years, have seen probably more than 2x in some of the investment. I think what the difference this year and what we're really working together on in like a very broad coalition is kind of the technical aspect of making this a true weight where these areas are part of the base foundation and they're predictable and they're based off of that number that we know is going to be there each year, instead of just wondering every year, okay, what is that risk going to be this year? What is ELL going to be this year? So I think that's kind of the technical difference that might not sound like much of a difference, but we think in the long term it will give schools a lot more flexibility and ability to use these dollars where they're needed most. Megan, anything you want to add on that?
I would just say we probably talked a lot in education about miracles. So you might have heard of the Mississippi Miracle, where all of a sudden things have come together. And it's actually much more like a marathon. Mississippi's been doing the same kind of important work for the last 10 plus years. And so it might feel like to some of the people listening today, you might not have heard of weighted student funding formula. It might be a brand new thing for you. But I appreciate Matt really grounding us that the SFRC report came out 8 years ago in 2018. And so it has been 8 years of conversations and things happening behind the scenes. And so it's exciting to think that we're at the point where this could really become something, but so many people have put forth just a huge amount of effort to get to this point.
Just really quickly on one thing Matt said, we actually did have the infrastructure study come out, which was kind of a follow-up on SFRC. It's a huge number for infrastructure. It's well over, I think, $8 to $10 billion, and I think we've heard that was actually probably pretty conservative, and that it frankly didn't include some elements of infrastructure. We're trying to bite off what we can chew right now, which is just trying to get support just to move to this model and get our base foundation funded adequately. But as Matt said, that's kind of the next step that is going to be, critically important in the future. The next few slides, and this is kind of the other element of the weighted model that we're working really hard with the legislature that was not in the governor's budget, but it's the idea of setting a target-based foundation in statute or in law so that we at least have a target to get to each year and that these weights are based off of. And so what we're kind of trying to look at is literally taking the SFRC, so this $9,590 number, and have as part of CREC, so that's the revenue conference that happens in May and kind of sets the final numbers. Make them calculate what the base foundation would be using that 2018 number, but adjusting it for inflation. And that just sets a target. It does not lock the legislature, the governor's office into having that be the number. And I don't think we would expect us to be able to get to that number. But to Megan's point about Mississippi and others, this is a marathon, not a sprint. And so that's kind of the other kind of piece that we're really pushing for in Lansing. And the next two slides kind of show what we'd argue is, in the last 15, 20 years, we've kind of gotten away from really funding that foundation, and we've kind of spread out the funding to a lot of these categoricals, and we've actually fallen behind in our base funding because of that. So unless Megan or Matt have anything else on just kind of that, we can move into kind of that more bigger picture discussion.
Sounds good.
Okay, so this slide kind of shows the foundation allowance growth since 1995. And just very briefly, the reason you see two numbers is because we had this gap between the minimum and maximum foundation since 1994. And as you can see, this is a genuine positive through time, frankly, through this kind of 2x formula. The legislature eliminated that gap. And so now we do have one base foundation, and that is a good thing. So that is kind of showing just the overall foundation growth up through now. So you look at it, okay, seems it's up. Next slide. This is that kind of same number, only adjusted for inflation. And again, you can see we kind of closed the equity gap, but you can see the top, again, if you account for inflation, and if you account for kind of just how some of the dollars have spread out to other categoricals, the funding has actually declined. And so again, kind of going back to this idea of setting a target-based foundation, we think that's critically important to just kind of let everyone know, hey, this is where we should be. This is where we're at. And so that's kind of the point of these two slides is it's not just the weights, it's about bringing up the base foundation so that those weights are actually adequate.
Matt, I think when you talk about this, a lot of legislators and others get scared saying, well, we don't have money to do this right now. And so one of the things that I think we've all talked about is it's not necessarily asking for a bigger pie to be able to do all these things. Ideally, over time would be wonderful. But right now, it's how do we make different decisions with the dollars that are available today? And so you probably saw on an earlier slide that the at-risk weight would be about 35%. So if base per pupil funding is 10,000, give or take, that'd be an extra $3,500 for at-risk students. We're not there right now. We're probably closer to 25%, a little lower than that. But how can schools know, okay, that's the target is 35%. And if we're at 23 or 24% right now, that's okay, but what's the path to ultimately get to that? And that's something that, as Matt showed in his slide before, it took us about 30 years to get Foundation A, or sorry, Proposal A to really equalize the foundation allowance. I hope it doesn't take that long for weighted funding, but we do need to be thoughtful and patient about that. And it is just getting us on a track that would help students be more successful and schools be able to plan for the long term, making more decisions on the local control level.
Yep. And to Megan's point, and I won't touch on the whole issue of the school aid fund and higher ed transfers, but even leaving that aside, something that we've really been highlighting, it's not in my slides today, but if you just visually look at the size of the school aid fund budget, the amount of pages in the bill, the amount of sections in the bill, it's doubled about in the last decade. And I think there's a few reasons. One is just I think there's more reporting, just kind of in some of these funds. But I think the other reason is quite simply the dollars that are in the fund that are used for K-12 education are kind of almost being diluted and going into these a bunch of new categoricals, and some of which have value. But again, I think the point of this, not only with the setting the foundation target, but the target for the weight is to show these are the core areas that the state needs to focus on. And yes, we don't have all of it now, but if we were more focused on these areas, we could get a lot closer than we currently are. All right. And so this is just kind of like a very brief summary of kind of where we are, at this stage. So again, establish an adequate foundation target. I think, that's the area where, we're really trying to work on to get something included in one of the budgets. Part of that is updating the target as part of CREC. Moving the core categoricals into weights. And again, we kind of crossed off ELL and at risk. We're cautiously optimistic that both the House and Senate are going to do something similar to the governor's office on that. This next one is, very important. Eliminate restricted boilerplate, and that kind of gets to again the technical difference between just giving 2x increases to funds and actually moving them into a true weighted foundation. When you do that, you kind of get rid of some of the restricted boilerplate, some of the reporting that makes it harder for schools to really get the biggest bang for their buck in those areas.
Yeah, and Matt, you and I talk about this a little bit differently, but one of the things I love to say is there are like 100 categorical grants out there right now. And Matt's done the analysis. It's not in these slides, but I love talking about how much the school aid budget has grown over time, just how many pages it's gotten bigger. Well, that's because every time we add a new categorical grant, we add more restrictive boilerplate, and there are more strings attached. And then you have to apply to MDE to get those grant funds. And I think there was an article in the Bridge magazine today that talked about,
Yep.
superintendents, especially more rural superintendents, just saying, I know I need to apply for this grant, but I don't have anybody who has the time to apply for it. And I've applied for this categorical in the past and haven't gotten it. And so what does it mean to eliminate some of that, some of those hoops that schools have to jump through for a limited amount of funding? I know there are times people look at it and say, well, it's only $25 a student, but the paperwork and the audit requirements and all of those things, it's going to cost me more than it's worth. And you don't ever want people looking at the budget and saying, I'd rather turn down funds available for my students. And I know nobody wants to do that, but sometimes the restrictive boilerplate has brought that about. So
Yep.
just
No,
wanted
that's,
to
I mean, we have superintendents up north that they are the superintendent, the principal, the athletic director, janitor, and grant writer. And they just don't have the capacity to even apply for these. And, it turns into an equity issue. And then on the other hand, you have districts that do have the capacity. And so they hire someone to be a grant writer. And then we hear from the legislature how administration is too bloated. And we're like, well, you're kind of making us do this in order to access funds for our students.
Or we have situations like the mental health and safety funding where restrictive language is included that
Yeah,
frankly
75% of our districts are taking
didn't
the
even
money down.
apply for it. It's a huge number. Yes. So there's a lot that goes into this, but it certainly makes sense. All right. Sorry.
Yeah, so again, kind of the last bullet point is just kind of the areas we still need to get to. Again, assuming we make some progress with the ELL and at risk. Again, special education, I think is the by far the biggest lift. I think CTE and rural isolated should be, I won't say easy, but relatively straightforward. And again, I think transportation, both as a policy issue, but frankly, just politically and trying to appeal to certain legislators, I think transportation is going to be really, really important to kind of fold into this. And then again, as Matt said, the other elephant in the room is infrastructure, which we're not even trying to address yet. So that's kind of where we're at. As Matt said, I think we're hoping for House and Senate budgets to come out sometime in April. We're hopeful that there will be waits. And then again, we're really, really hoping that they get the budget done on time. And I think that's all of kind of our prepared remarks, unless Megan, you have some more to add.
Well, I've got some questions I'll tee up, and then, like we said, feel free to pop your questions into the chat for anything else that might come in. So, I mean, one of the things I think that gets lost in this conversation, and I want you guys to expand on a little bit, is I think it's important that we remind people, and for us ourselves to remember that this whole endeavor is centered around outcomes, right? And it's really about, I mean, so we right now we're hearing all this conversation about literacy, right? And our literacy rates and our proficiency on the scores. They're not, we're ranked 44th in the country, and there's all these questions around the governor's specific investments, proposed investments into literacy, and we've tried these things before and we're not moving the needle. But I think what's lost sometimes in the broad picture conversation around weighted funding formulas is that this is exactly centered around outcomes. And so dig into that a little bit more, maybe just kind of backing up to why it's important for us to recognize in funding, why it's important to, ELL and even just specifically the ELL and at risk, why, that makes sense. It makes sense
Yep.
to increase our investments in those areas.
Yeah, I mean, and again, the SFRC is kind of the Bible on this, and there's a reason that that's what they concluded. I think it's there's a tendency in Lansing when the legislators see a problem and they want to fix it, and it's a lot easier for them to say, okay, let's make 31 double A or 31 double B, and we can check the box that in this case, school safety has been checked. We are now devoting specific money, to school safety. This year, as you said, it's literacy. There's $600 million in new investments in the governor's budget, which I think there's a lot of one-time and kind of interesting little ways to get to that number. But to your point, Matt, the research shows, and our members firmly believe this, that the way to increase outcomes, the way to increase literacy rates, test scores, is to get these dollars into the classroom and recognize that kids cost differently to educate. And I know that sounds very simple, but it is very simple. And I think, our challenge has been to make the legislature understand that and still say, hey, we'll give you credit, but this is really the best way to do this. It's not just it's not diluting the pie and carving up the pie so you can, say we've solved literacy. This is really the angle that you need to take, because this is what gives it's I think I said it earlier, it's the most bang for your buck as far as the schools being able to spend this money on staff, on interventions, and on outcomes.
Matt and I would just add on, when we look at how the student population has changed in Michigan from 1994, the last time we did a big change in student funding, we have a higher percentage of students with disabilities. We have a huge increase in our at-risk or economically disadvantaged. So in kind of the mid 90s, it was about 30% of the student population. It's over 53% of the student population today. And English language learners, we only began to track that about 20 years ago, and it was 3% of the population, and it's more than doubled. And so our students are coming to us with different needs, more needs than they had in the past. And so this is a system that really would allow funding to follow the student needs, follow those needs, and then allow schools to make decisions based on that. And, Matt, I think one of the things people talk about a lot is accountability. And so I want to make sure that we aren't getting confused kind of between red tape and bureaucracy and actual accountability. We believe that this is going to drive student outcomes far more than turning in applications and reports and things like that. And we know that Michigan doesn't have an easy to understand comprehensive accountability system right now, but that doesn't mean there isn't a ton of accountability in the system. And there's federal requirements, and it is these top groups that we're talking about: economically disadvantaged, English language learners, students with special needs. We're required to report that out. And we believe that funding dedicated to meeting those needs will show good outcomes as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is fundamentally restructuring, right, the formula to recognize those changes. And I think that's a perfect way to say it. And I remember one of the big conversations around this back in the SFRC when the report was coming out was about the increase in concentrated poverty, right? And concentrated higher concentrations of economically disadvantaged students in particular districts. And the huge challenges that that presents, right, to education, to the education systems, to those local school districts, LEAs and others. And so, yeah, I mean, that's the fundamental piece of this. And I think you're
Matt, if
right.
I can chime in really quickly off that, Megan
Sure.
mentioned this piece. I think one area that we're really trying to kind of shine a spotlight on is, I think there are certain legislators who hear ELL and at risk and just think it's an urban issue. And, there's an article in Bridge up north and in the UP. Rural poverty is a huge issue up, I mean, everywhere, but I hear it a lot from our northern superintendents. And so, part of this discussion is really just, I think, making them understand that this is a statewide issue. It might look a little bit different, but a lot of the issues, are the same.
You're absolutely right. I mean, I'm in Alpena right now, but I mean Alpena, but most of Northeast Michigan, these districts, the percentage of economically disadvantaged students is as high or higher than anywhere else in the state, and that's the UP and everywhere else. So no, you're absolutely right, and that gets into the politics of this a little bit. So I want to dig into that a little bit as well. Transportation was another one. I've made this point on a couple of meetings I've been in. Interestingly, well, I chaired the school aid budget 100 years ago, not 1994, Megan, but shortly thereafter, I'll say. It was a little longer than that. But we actually implemented the transportation categorical for the first time. It didn't look like does now, but it was the first one, and actually implemented 2X at that time as well. But the transportation issue in particular was politically much different at that point. We had Democrats, we were in the majority as Democrats in the House, but primarily because we had Democrats representing rural districts in outstate Michigan that, were really fighting for the transportation needs and costs of their districts and other things. Whereas that's shifted politically completely now. But so now you see Republicans are the ones championing and really, standing up for this transportation being a critical component for districts. But let's talk more broadly politically about this, maybe here in Michigan, but even in other states to the extent that like how has this played out in Colorado politically? Where are the fault lines? What can we learn from states that are maybe further ahead on this journey of enacting weighted funding formulas, on how the politics on this plays out?
I think it's a great question. And I watched Colorado firsthand, and I've also had the opportunity to hear directly about Mississippi. So I'll kind of talk about both of those. Colorado was really wonderful in that the speaker championed it, and then also a key Republican senator who was a huge champion for school choice and charter schools. They worked together. And so Colorado managed to do something both bipartisan and bicameral, and that was really wonderful. I think the other thing that they did in Colorado was take their time. So they knew that the rollout of this was going to be complicated and they didn't try to get everything done all at once. And they did a lot of what we're doing here. They wrote a pretty simple formula, right? They didn't try to put every single thing in there right now. And so that's one of the things I respect. There might be more weights that we want to talk about in the future, but getting the core weights done and going is something that Colorado prioritized. Conversations I've had about Mississippi was also making sure that districts knew how this was going to impact them. And I think that's something that we hear all the time. In Colorado, the state Department of Education was able to run the numbers. In Mississippi, they worked on it a little bit differently, and they had kind of this website that was just up and going. And so anytime a new legislative proposal was out there, you as a district could go in and plug in, okay, these are my at-risk students, this is my EL, how's this going to filter down for me? And I've been glad to see the district impact report from the governor. But every time we talk about a new tweak, that's something. I think the other thing was making sure that this was fair across the state. And so it wasn't like that there were a certain class of school that were all negatively impacted. One of the things we talk a lot about in Michigan are Kent and um, and Oakland as kind of more purple counties, what's happening there. And so I immediately in the governor's district impact report looked at that and saw, okay, all of those school districts funding went up. And so making sure that there's not any specific type of district that's negatively impacted. And then once you do those kind of things, they tend to pass in a pretty bipartisan and with, I mean, nothing's ever unanimous, right? But with a really high percentage of support. And so I think that is an optimistic and perhaps naive goal, but one that I want to work as hard as we can in Michigan to make sure we can do the same thing.
And I think you're kind of seeing that, this year, traditional public schools, charter schools, labor, business, we've all testified in support of this, just this year. I think that's great. I think a few kind of challenges. I don't know about any other state other than Michigan, so I'll just say the challenges that I see in Michigan. One is just literally explaining it to legislators who just don't understand what this is. I think to Megan's point, maybe a slightly different spin on it is, there's so many different groups and associations and just areas that they all, they like this, but they also want their one thing. And so I think we're trying to collectively, okay, we all know we have our own little things, but this is at the top of all of our list. And I think that's very important strategically. Just because again, we've seen with this explosion in categoricals, you create, brand new interest groups, brand new groups who want to protect that. And so I think just trying to get everyone, at least in our sphere, kind of focused is very important. I think kind of the last challenge in Michigan, again, I won't get into this in too much detail because we could talk about it for hours, but if the school aid fund was operating as I believe it was intended to in 1994, we would have significantly more dollars to get very close to this weighted foundation and the target foundation. And if you just look at the last literally 12 months, kind of the proposals to kind of take money from that fund, it could be double what it has been if those proposals get enacted. So kind of thinking more, again, Michigan specific, I think to make any of this happen, we really need to look at that and what the intent of Proposal A really was.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I mean, Michigan's, I think, has a lot of unique challenges from a state legislative standpoint. I mean, we're one of the few states with a full-time legislature. We have a full-time lobbying industry built around that legislature that gladly is taking on new clients, pushing for new categoricals around you name it that we've seen. And that's a different challenge that most, a lot of other states don't have. But I think, and Megan in particular, you talked about it, both about the bipartisan support. And I've noted, even like we said, just yesterday, we had the business leaders from Michigan testifying in support of weighted funding formulas right alongside AFT, one of the large teacher union groups, at the same committee hearing. And we've seen this kind of across the political spectrum support and buy-in for this. And that's critical for any sort of longevity that we're going to see, any long-term change that we're going to see. One of the things we just talked about a little bit earlier, but one of the areas we've seen success in Michigan over the last several years is on the pre-K side and on state investment into pre-K. Well, we're all talking about it under Governor Whitmer, who made the big, bold push for universal, but that really started under Governor Snyder when we had a Republican-controlled legislature. We made a significant investment into our four-year-old pre-K funding and our GSRP program under Snyder, and that carried forward then into Governor Whitmer, obviously a Democratic governor. But I think for any of these things, when we talk about structural changes to the funding formula for education like this in Michigan, you need to have that bipartisan support because we are a purple state. We are gonna shift, who knows how often, but between divided government or single party government and then maybe the other party government and back and forth. But you need to have that fundamental, bipartisan interest group across the political spectrum support for something like this to really take hold, and recognizing that it is going to be a multi-year game. This isn't we're not playing a short game here, but I think we're on the right track. And so I'm hopeful that we can continue this conversation, continue moving forward. I know a lot of us would like to see it go even faster. Obviously, that's a challenge. Another thing I'll point out is that, these types of changes or shifts are obviously easier to do when there's money available, right? I mean, if we're talking about shifting the funding formula where there's no money and we're talking about cuts, I mean, we ran into this with the 2X, right? When the couple of years there under Snyder where they had to cut the funding. Some of us, from an equity standpoint, were arguing, well, you had to 2X the cut if we wanted to keep it, moving towards well, that didn't fly, but it is a challenge, and so yes, I think that hopefully we're on the right track. It's interesting to hear about Colorado. Mississippi's a little bit of a different game, even on the literacy side. There's a lot of other things going on there. I know it gets pointed to a lot. Massachusetts is another state that we like to point to. Now, they're a little bit of a different game, too, on the higher end of the funding, but they have also moved towards, much more of a weighted formula or distribution of how they're distributing funds. And so, I think there are examples out there for us to follow. And, the politics are going to be challenging, but they are with everything. And now's the time to do it. I do think the infrastructure thing is going to be it's a glaring red light in front of us that we're coming head at, because I've said all along, it's hard to get, the general public to understand or to think that we are anywhere near equitable school funding when their kids might be in a school building that's 60 or 70 years old, and, their nieces and nephews in a suburban community down, if they're up north, and then their nieces and nephews are in a suburban community down south that are in brand new, school buildings that look like college campuses to folks that live in rural Michigan. And so that's going to be a challenge in and of itself. But I think we're on the right track here with the weighted funding formula approach that we're taking. So what's next, do you think? I know, Matt, you talked about this a little bit. You're hopeful that we're going to see the House and Senate and the final budget first of all, we're all hopeful that we get a budget done and the process doesn't devolve into what it did last year. But that it does reflect, some version of what we've seen from the governor and what appear to be the interests of the House and the Senate at this time. And then where do we go from there? What do you think the next step is for weighted funding here in Michigan?
I honestly, kind of getting back into the political again, I'm pretty optimistic for this year, but we really have no idea what the legislature and the governor's office is going to look like next January. And I think that, is going to play a huge role in this, which is why, frankly, I would love to get some of this kind of into the system to just kind of, for whoever is in charge next year, they kind of know, okay, we've already started this process, give it some time to work. I think ideally we would see, again, I think ELL and at risk, we'll see some versions of weights in all three of the budgets. I think what I'm looking at is the foundation increase. The governor's recommendation was 2.5%, which is not equal to inflation. So I think in the short term, we're hoping that final number, as well as the weights, can be increased. And again, I think that goes back to the point about just making this more of a focused product, if you will. But again, I think it's starting, getting the ball rolling, getting the base set, no pun intended, and then kind of picking which area to try and bite off next. Again, I think special ed is probably going to take the longest just because of how complicated it is.
Matt, I'm glad you were willing to show your crystal ball first for what the next little bit is going to look like. I do agree. I was really encouraged by some of the things that Chair Camilleri said at the end of the subcommittee hearing yesterday, where he just talked about a desire to get to a bipartisan solution on this. And so want to agree, I think there's good momentum. I would anticipate the House is going to do something similar to what they did last year, which is look at categoricals and try to say how many of these do we need, right? And I do believe that there are some categoricals that are key priorities for legislators and aren't going to go away, but sort of coming to some understanding of what are those key categoricals and then what other things are on the table that potentially could be rolled up to accelerate this is something that I would expect to see. But we are hopeful that we're going to see budgets in mid-April and kind of be back on a more kind of quote unquote normal timeline for getting a budget done. I think Matt and I share a goal, which is we'd love the school aid budget to be slimmer in the future, right? And to have a plan so that in future years, the consensus revenue estimating committee, that correct that Matt talked about, comes out in May, sort of tells us how much money there is. Everybody looks at each other and says, okay, great, we've got a formula. Here's how it's going to go. And the budget can be passed. And when schools are passing their budget by the end of June, as is required, they'll have a really good idea of where they're going to be. So again, looking towards the future with a lot of hope and optimism, but also knowing there's a lot of work and challenges ahead.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think you're both right. I think the key is right, like as we've talked about, is getting this established, getting this concept, this idea in place. Sure, we'd love to see the weights, as high as we can see them and recognize that. But the foundational part of getting this enacted, getting people to understand the importance of this and getting it in, and then in subsequent years, we'll be arguing for what should the weights really be and how can we reflect what really is needed and in the true meaning of the SFRC study and how do we get there. But the first step is getting it in. And I agree. And the other, Matt, I'm glad you mentioned the elections. I mean, at Michigan's Children, we've, for many years now, many election cycles have been strong proponents of the notion that elections are huge advocacy opportunities. And so we certainly do what we can to encourage our partners and the folks in our networks to engage with candidates for state office, from state rep through state senate, all the way up to the governor's office around issues that are important to them. And I think this fits perfectly for that, right? And having this conversation now, we can build on this after the budget into that election space to really get candidates running for office across the political spectrum to understand the importance of this, understand why this needs to be a priority, and to commit to it. And so that whoever wins these races and whoever is representing their constituents in the legislature next year and in the governor's office understands and is bought into the idea and the importance of enacting a weighted funding formula here in Michigan, and then driving that funding formula to really meet the equity needs, the adequacy and equity needs that the state has. And so I think that's the excitement for us. I mean, this is a critical election in Michigan. We've got the entire legislature up. We're going to have a new governor. And so we really, I think, have an opportunity, but also an obligation and a duty as advocates to get out there and get candidates to understand this and to commit to supporting and to moving us down this path that we are now on and that we're starting towards true adequacy and equity in school funding. And so it's a optimistic time. I share your optimism, Megan, that I think we're on the path to something, and ideally we'll fix all the other woes. I agree with you, Matt, that the school aid fund is being used as a piggy bank for a whole lot of purposes that it shouldn't be, and fixing all those things obviously will allow us to put more money into the weights where we want them to be and other things. But I think we're on the right track. Well, anything else you two would like to add before we close out here?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity and looking forward to what we can see to benefit Michigan students and children.
Well, thank you both for the work that you do, and thank you for taking a little bit of your time to be with us today. But thank you most importantly for the work that you do and for your commitment to this cause. And you can find more information about the weighted funding formula. We'll certainly be, we included a big piece of it in our budget basics based on the governor's proposal that came out. We'll be updating that as budgets emerge from both the House and the Senate. Like I said, hopefully here mid to late April. And certainly doing all that we can to keep everybody informed on where things stand on this issue, as well as the other priorities that we have in the state budget. But you can look for all of that on our website at michiganschildren.org. And thanks for tuning in, and tune in again next month for another Lunch and Learn, where we'll bring you another topic of interest for kids and families here in Michigan. Thanks.